The day Rachel Morrison's life collapsed began with a thin government-style envelope slipped through the mail slot, an afterthought on a morning already bruised by bad news. Hours later, divorce papers arrived like a final verdict, and an eviction notice clung to her apartment door as if the universe wanted the shame to be visible. But it was the envelope, quiet, official, strangely cold, that changed the direction of her life. Inside, a short letter informed her that Colonel James Hartwell, her father's reclusive brother, had named her sole beneficiary of a property hidden deep in the Mojave Desert. She remembered him only as a rigid shadow at 2 funerals, a man who stood apart with eyes scanning horizons no one else could see. But poverty has a way of turning even mysteries into lifelines. Her son Tyler's 2 small shoes and cereal for dinner routine made her swallow her doubts and cling to fragile hope. Maybe her uncle had left her nothing but dust and debt. But maybe, just maybe, this was the miracle she had stopped believing in. So she packed water bottles and granola bars, loaded her son into their battered Honda, and drove toward coordinates scribbled on a lawyer's letterhead. Strip malls thinned into desert, the road became a suggestion, and the land grew wild and empty. When the massive, rusted aircraft hangar finally rose from the wasteland like a wounded beast, Rachel felt the truth settle in her stomach. Miracles did not look like this. But she pushed open the door anyway, unaware that this ruin held the secret that would rewrite her entire life. Inside the hangar, time felt suspended. Dust motes floated like memories in a cavernous room that should have reeked of abandonment, but instead smelled of oil, steel, and meticulous order. It was as though someone had left only moments before, despite decades on the calendar. The flashlight beam revealed immaculate shelves, labeled parts, organized tools, and 3 massive military vehicles draped under tarps like sleeping titans. Beneath each tarp, pristine machines gleamed with impossible care. An ancient Jeep restored better than new, a formidable Humvee with notes about a recent transmission rebuild, and a 6-wheeled transport truck built for war and surviving the end of the world. Keys hung neatly on labeled hooks, as though her uncle had prepped them for her arrival. But what rattled Rachel most was the envelope waiting in a precise drawer, her name written not as Rachel Morrison, but as Rachel Hartwell Morrison, each letter drawn with military certainty. The letter inside unraveled the myth of the damaged hermit. Uncle James had been watching, knowing her struggles, regretting his distance, and planning in silence. He told her that beneath her feet lay something life-altering, something he had spent 47 years protecting. Hidden beneath the hangar was an asset recovered during the final chaotic days of Saigon, property legally hers under forgotten salvage laws. Her heartbeat thundered as she found the hydraulic panel, entered her birthday, and watched a concrete slab rise like breath from the earth. The vault door waited beneath, cold and heavy, a gateway to a truth neither grief nor poverty had prepared her to face. The vault opened like a confession. Rachel's flashlight sliced through the cold darkness and ignited on shelves stacked with impossible wealth. Rows of U.S. minted gold bars, each too heavy for her trembling hands. Silver bricks shining like frozen moonlight. Vacuum-sealed stacks of $100 bills with serial numbers crisp as new snowfall. Bearer bonds preserved in fireproof folders. Velvet trays of gemstones, watches, and jewelry with histories best left unspoken. A handwritten notation tallied the estimated value, $278 million. She nearly collapsed, anchored only by Tyler's small arms clinging to her waist and his whisper, "Mom, are we rich now?" But even as awe choked her, the world outside pressed in. Her phone regained signal long enough to show eviction messages, threats from her ex-husband Daniel's lawyer, and warnings of a custody challenge. Her past was pounding at the door of her future. Then came the call from a stranger, Margaret Chen, a woman her uncle had trusted for decades. Calm, precise, and armed with knowledge that chilled Rachel, Margaret urged her to lock everything, take one gold bar for authentication, and flee. Some watchers were allies, others were not. Every word sounded like a crossroads. Every shadow outside felt like danger. With Tyler asleep on her shoulder and a fortune in her backpack, Rachel drove into a night that felt darker and deeper than the vault itself, toward a woman who might be her only shield against a world ready to devour her newfound inheritance. Margaret Chen was not what Rachel expected. In a quiet warehouse lit by sterile lamps, she moved with the composure of someone accustomed to handling the dangerous and the priceless. She authenticated the gall. Barr with scientific ease, reviewed James's documents with reverence, and revealed a truth Rachel had never imagined. Wealth was power, but also peril. Daniel, her unfaithful soon-to-be ex-husband, would demand half if she disclosed everything or accuse her of fraud if she didn't. Either path was a battlefield, but Margaret had a plan forged from years of preparing for this exact moment. Rachel would create a protective trust, transfer the assets into it, liquidate slowly to avoid government scrutiny, and enter the divorce meeting armed with legality, documentation, and strategic silence. With Margaret's network securing the hangar and arranging a safe rental SUV, Rachel stepped into the law office days later transformed, not by money, but by purpose. Daniel's confusion curdled into fear as her attorney leveraged airtight appraisals, inheritance laws, and Daniel's own abandonment against him. The meeting ended with Rachel retaining her property, gaining primary custody of Tyler, and refusing child support on the one condition Daniel finally step up as a father. She walked out of that office not as the woman Daniel had dismissed, but as a Hartwell, a woman with resources, resolve, and the echoes of two soldiers behind her. Her new life waited in the desert hangar, where the fortune remained hidden, but its promise had already begun reshaping her future. The following months became a quiet resurrection. Under Margaret's guidance, the gold and bonds trickled through discreet financial channels while Rachel shed the weight of years in the form of debts, overdue bills, and the relentless fear of scarcity. She purchased a modest home in a safe neighborhood, a place where Tyler could race his bike across a yard without dodging traffic or broken glass. She hired advisors trusted by Margaret, set up a protected educational trust for Tyler, and learned the strange discipline of responsible wealth. Meanwhile, she renovated the hangar into a sanctuary of memory and purpose. The vehicles stayed, humming back to life under her steady hands. The vault, emptied but still sacred, remained open as a reminder of the night her world shifted. And above the workbench hung the photograph of her father and uncle, young, unscarred men standing shoulder to shoulder in Vietnam, smiling at a future neither would live to see. Grief and gratitude tangled inside her each time she looked at it. Slowly, Rachel grew into her inheritance, not the gold but the responsibility. She understood why her uncle had waited decades, guarding treasure with the same discipline he once protected soldiers. This fortune wasn't meant for indulgence. It was a tool for rebuilding lives, starting with her own. And as Tyler thrived, visiting his father on stable terms, Rachel knew she had stepped out of the shadow of survival and into a legacy built on sacrifice, secrecy, and faith in the impossible. Her mission crystallized on a desert evening when Margaret joined her at the hangar, both women seated beneath a sky blooming with stars. The question Margaret posed was simple. "What will you build now?" The answer came like an awakening. Rachel would turn her inheritance into a lifeline for people who lived the fear she once carried every day. She launched the Hartwell Family Foundation quietly, offering legal aid to women in crisis, emergency funds to families facing eviction, support for veterans abandoned by the systems meant to protect them. Small grants changed entire lives. A mother saved from homelessness, a father able to keep his job after car repairs, a child shielded during a custody battle. The vault's fortune, once dormant beneath concrete, became an engine of transformation. Even Treasury officials eventually arrived, tracing gold serial numbers to her foundation, but instead of confiscation, they offered gratitude. The assets were legally hers, and the work she was doing surpassed what any agency had achieved with similar resources. As years passed, the foundation grew, her anonymity faded by necessity, and her story became one of quiet legend. She spoke publicly for the first time at the foundation's symposium, honoring her uncle not by recounting the gold, but by celebrating the integrity that forged a legacy capable of outliving war, secrecy, and time itself. And when strangers approached her with gratitude, Rachel understood she had fulfilled the promise he left buried beneath desert stone. Years unfolded like a long exhale. Tyler grew into a young man with his great uncle's discipline and his mother's resilience. The foundation expanded across states, rescuing families from the brink and steadying lives derailed by circumstances Rachel knew too intimately. Even the government sought her partnership as other forgotten, salvaged assets surfaced, relics of chaotic wars and forgotten promises. Through it all, the hangar remained her compass. It housed foundation offices, historical exhibits honoring Operation Harvest Moon, and the vehicle's meticulu, meticulously preserved as symbols of endurance. The empty vault became a time capsule filled with letters from the people whose lives had been transformed by the wealth once hidden there. But the most profound moment arrived when Tyler, now a scholar, dreamer, and engineer, stood beside her under the night sky and asked why his great uncle had never used the money himself. Rachel answered with the clarity of someone who had finally understood. Because he was waiting for someone who remembered what it felt like to have nothing, someone who would use it to give others a chance. The desert wind carried the truth between them. James Hartwell had not saved gold. He had saved hope. And Rachel, broken, rebuilt, and unyielding, had become the steward of that hope, turning secrecy into salvation and inheritance into a bridge between generations who believed the world could be better. Decades after the envelope first arrived, Rachel stood at the dedication of the Hartwell Center for Family Justice, a sanctuary built from sacrifice, designed to protect families from the very suffering she once endured. Tyler, on his way to MIT and a future shaped by integrity, stood proudly beside her. Even Daniel attended quietly, softened by years and humbled by transformation. After the ceremony, Rachel returned alone to the hangar where everything had begun. The vault, now sealed with a letter of her own inside, rested beneath layers of reconstructed flooring. She placed her hand on the concrete, feeling the weight of all the lives touched by what had once been a burden hidden in the dark. Her uncle's legacy no longer sat in a vault. It existed in every family saved, every child protected, every person lifted out of despair. As night drew across the desert and stars pierced the sky like silver promises, Rachel whispered into the quiet, "Thank you." She did not need an answer. The echo lived in the Foundation's work, in Tyler's future, in the countless stories rewritten because one soldier had believed in a woman he barely knew. And as she stepped out of the hangar, closing the heavy door behind her, the desert wind carried a gentle truth. Some inheritances are measured not in gold, but in the courage to turn broken beginnings into powerful, redemptive endings. Thank you for listening to this story. May its echo stay with you long after the desert goes quiet.